It was a grey winter morning in 1943 at Kummersdorf, the secret heart of German testing grounds, where the Reich's engineers measured their machines against the laws of physics themselves. The air was brittle with frost, and the field was streaked with frozen mud. From the mist, an unfamiliar shape emerged, squat, broad, and foreign. It was an American M4 Sherman, captured in Tunisia and shipped here as a curiosity. It rolled forward slowly, its olive hull dull beneath the snow. For the first time, a Sherman had come to German soil. Around it, the engineers gathered. They were the elite of their profession, men from Krupp, Henschel, and Porsche, men who saw steel as art and tolerance as a creed. To them, this was not a machine of war, but a specimen to be mocked. They smirked as they circled it, tracing their gloved fingers over the crude welds and uneven seams. One officer, a veteran of the Tiger program, gave a thin smile. "American craftsmanship," he murmured, "built like a tractor." Laughter rippled through the group, muffled by the cold. Cameras clicked as the engine started. The sound was low and even, not the harsh growl of a Maybach, but something steadier, more restrained. The Sherman eased forward, its tracks gripping the icy ground with a mechanical calm that seemed out of place. The Germans expected clatter, smoke, failure. Instead, they saw motion, simple, untroubled motion. The test began. Across the proving ground, the Sherman climbed a muddy incline, crossed a patch of ice, and waded through frozen ruts without complaint. Its suspension flexed, its gears shifted cleanly. Each kilometer passed, and still it moved. One by one, the engineers stopped speaking. The laughter thinned, then died altogether. Someone scribbled in a notebook, another checked a stopwatch. Oil pressure, steady. Engine temperature, stable. It was an uncomfortable sight. A foreign tank that refused to break down, that behaved not like a rival, but like a revelation. When the test ended, no one spoke. The Sherman stood still in the snow, engine idling softly, the sound of reliability in a world obsessed with perfection. And as the frost settled again over Kummersdorf, one thought hung unspoken among them. If this was American mediocrity, what did that say about German mastery? But inside the testing halls, their laughter would soon be tested too, by an idea they could neither perfect nor defeat. In the heart of Germany's wartime industry, precision was not just a practice, it was a belief system. Every bolt, every gear, every contour of steel was shaped under the doctrine that perfection was both a weapon and a virtue. At factories in Kassel and Stuttgart, engineers worked under magnifying lamps, measuring tolerances to the micron. Machines were not merely assembled, they were sculpted, each part an affirmation of national pride. The names behind this creed read like a pantheon of mechanical genius. Krupp, Henschel, Porsche. Men who believed that engineering was an art form, and that art could win a war. Their tanks were designed not to be produced, but to be revered. Every weld was deliberate, every curve justified. Even the Tiger, the Folieri, their crowning achievement, embodied that faith. At 57 tons, it was a monument to precision, its gun capable of piercing armor at 2 kilometers, its armor thick enough to deflect nearly anything that faced it. But perfection had its price. The same tolerances that made the Tiger formidable also made it fragile. Each gearbox had to be hand-fitted, each component tuned like an instrument. A single tank could take months to complete. When a Tiger broke down in the field, and it often did, the repair manuals might as well have been written in prayer. What should have been industrial power became an artist's burden. Still, the engineers believed. They saw complexity as superiority and craftsmanship as destiny. They mocked Allied machinery as crude and soulless, the work of factories, not minds. In their view, a tank like the Sherman could never match a tiger's elegance or power. It was, to them, a mechanical barbarian. Yet behind the walls of Kummersdorf, the silence that followed the Sherman's trial was beginning to unsettle those convictions. For the first time, the German creed of perfection faced something it did not understand: simplicity that worked. The belief held firm, for now. But beneath it, a question had begun to stir. If precision could not guarantee endurance, what was the true measure of engineering? Far from Kummersdorf, another factory was already answering that question, not with craftsmanship, but with speed. Under the harsh lamps of the Kummersdorf workshop, the captured Sherman was stripped bare. Its armor plates were opened like pages of a book, revealing a language the Germans did not speak, the grammar of simplicity. Where their own machines hid labyrinths of interlocking systems, this American tank spoke in direct, uncomplicated lines. Its hull was cast in one piece, its suspension built to be replaced rather than repaired. Every joint, every fitting seemed designed for one purpose: to work and to keep working. The engineers gathered close. They studied the radial engine, a design born from aviation, compact and proven, capable of running in heat, dust, or snow. It was not elegant, but it was dependable. They noted the modular layout, components placed for access, not artistry. Filters could be removed in minutes, tracks replaced without special tools. Even the bolts, all standardized, could be loosened with the same wrench. It was not the precision they revered, but the practicality they had overlooked. There was no ornament in its welds, no hint of aesthetic pride. The steel was rough, the lines crude, and yet every detail served a function. To men raised in the cult of perfection, this seemed almost insulting. One engineer, wiping oil from his hands, muttered dryly, "It's built to be fixed by a farmer." Around him, quiet laughter broke the tension. Not mockery this time, but unease disguised as humor. They still dismissed it publicly. "Quantity over quality," one noted in the margin of his report. "A tank for the masses." Yet the figures emerging from the tests were beginning to disturb that certainty. Fewer breakdowns, shorter maintenance times, fewer specialized parts. The Sherman, built in the thousands, behaved like a single idea multiplied, each identical, each reliable. For years, German engineers had pursued the ideal of mechanical purity, believing complexity equaled superiority. Now, before them stood a tank that defied that logic entirely. It was not perfect, but it was relentless. And in war, that difference was beginning to matter. In the quiet of the workshop, one man looked again at the crude American machine and frowned, not at its flaws, but at its success. Soon they would push it harder, to prove or disprove what they could no longer ignore. The next morning, frost clung to the edges of the proving ground. A low mist rolled across the field as the captured Sherman was brought out again, its olive paint now scarred with mud from the first test. This time, there would be no short trial. The Germans had prepared a true examination. 100 kilometers of continuous movement across gravel, ice, and thawing soil. It was a test meant to exhaust the machine, to expose the weakness they believed was hidden beneath its simplicity. Engines roared to life across the yard. Generators, trucks, instruments. The Sherman's radial motor joined them, a low mechanical heartbeat beneath the winter air. At 0800 hours, the trial began. The tank rolled forward, its treads cutting clean tracks through the frozen surface. Around it, engineers followed in jeeps and on foot, notebooks in hand, eyes fixed on the foreign silhouette moving steadily through their homeland. By the 25th kilometer, the first murmurs began. The Tiger Yoi, their own standard of excellence, often required maintenance after similar distances, cooling issues, gearbox strain, or thrown tracks. The Sherman, however, gave no sign of fatigue. Oil pressure steady, temperature stable, no leaks, no smoke. It climbed a hill, crossed a half-frozen stream, and pressed on without pause. The observers grew quiet. At 60 kilometers, the silence deepened into disbelief. The machine that had been mocked for its crude construction now hummed like a metronome. Mechanics checked instruments twice, certain they had misread the gauges. One noted in his logbook, operational readiness maintained at 96%. For German machines of comparable weight, such endurance was almost unthinkable. When dusk fell, the Sherman was still moving. Its tracks glowed faintly from friction, but the engine tone never wavered. It idled through the night for tests of temperature control, the exhaust curling into the dark like a steady breath. By morning, it had covered the full 100 kilometers without mechanical failure, a feat none of them had predicted, and few could explain. As the engine finally shut down, steam rising from its vents, a mechanic leaned close to one of the engineers and spoke softly, a question born not of curiosity, but concern. How many of these can they build in a month? The answer came later that day, in a report from intelligence officers, 2,000 per month. The number landed like an artillery shell among the engineers. They had spent years perfecting a few hundred Tigers. The Americans were building an army of machines that refused to break. At Kummersdorf, amid the quiet hum of cooling metal, realization began to settle. Perfection could be defeated by persistence, and beyond Germany's borders, a different kind of perfection was already taking shape, one measured not in precision, but in production. Across the Atlantic, the sound of war was different. It was not the thunder of artillery or the scream of engines, it was the hum of factories. Detroit, 1943. Beneath a haze of steel dust and steam, a new kind of battlefield came alive, one of conveyor belts, stamping presses, and assembly lines that never slept. At the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, the first of its kind in the world, America's war machine moved with mathematical rhythm. Where Germany built tanks like cathedrals, America built them like cars. Under the vaulted ceilings of the arsenal, sparks fell like rain. Women in overalls welded hulls shoulder to shoulder, with men too old or too young to fight. The air was hot with oil and ambition. Every 30 minutes, a Sherman rolled off the line, tracked, tested, and painted in olive drab. The rhythm was relentless, a metronome of national purpose. Perfection was no longer a matter of craftsmanship, it was a matter of duplication. Ford's River Rouge plant, once a monument to civilian industry, had become a front line in itself, or entered one end of the complex. Steel and engines emerged from the other. Trains and trucks ferried parts to Detroit Arsenal, where each component found its place with mechanical precision. America had transformed engineering into choreography, stamping, riveting, welding, rolling. It was not artistry, it was orchestration. From the jungles of Malaya came rubber, from the mines of Minnesota came iron ore, from the furnaces of Pittsburgh came steel. Even before a Sherman reached the battlefield, it was already the child of continents. Every link in that chain existed for one purpose, to keep the machine of war moving. The supply lines were the arteries of democracy, pulsing with fuel, food, and firepower. Engineers in Detroit understood something the Germans did not. They were not chasing flawlessness, they were chasing repeatability. They designed parts to fit any tank, on any line, in any month of the war. A gun mount forged in Michigan could be bolted into a hull welded in California. There was no signature, no artist's touch, Only reliability replicated thousands of times. The Sherman, in this light, ceased to be a mere vehicle. It became an idea that victory belonged not to the rare and perfect, but to the common and dependable. Each machine embodied the philosophy of its nation: mass, motion, and endurance. Where Germany saw engineering as expression, America saw it as execution. The results were staggering. By the time a German factory completed a single Tiger, American plants had produced 50 Shermans. Even as Allied soldiers trained, their replacements were already being built. The machine had learned to outpace death itself. When German intelligence reviewed the reports, they were shaken not by the Sherman's armor or its gun, but by the system behind it. A translated document reached Berlin with a single chilling line: "They have made the tank into an industrial product." It was not meant as praise, but as warning, because behind that sentence lay a truth Germany could not reverse. The enemy had turned war into a science of production. And as the conveyor belts kept moving through the night, a new realization dawned across Europe. The battle would no longer be decided by who built the better tank, but by who could build the most and keep them running. For the Germans, this revelation struck like thunder, and soon the question reached their own design offices. If the Americans could build 2,000 tanks a month, what could Germany possibly do to match them? News of the captured Sherman's endurance spread quietly through Germany's engineering circles, carried not by newspapers, but by memos stamped Geheim. What began as curiosity at Kummersdorf soon became alarm. The data was undeniable. The American tank, crude and plain, had outlasted every benchmark they had set, and for a nation that had built its war effort upon the altar of precision, the implications were disturbing. In the design offices of Henschel, MAN, and Daimler-Benz, draftsmen stared at blueprints with new unease. For months, they had been refining what they believed to be the future of armored warfare, tanks that would embody German mastery of steel and science. Yet now, reports from the front told a different story. Tigers abandoned for want of parts, Panthers immobilized by transmission failures, Panzers burning for lack of fuel. Across the map, divisions that once roared forward now stood silent, victims of their own brilliance. When the news reached Hitler, the reaction was swift and furious. At a conference in early 1943, he demanded to know how inferior machines could dominate the battlefield. He blamed commanders, mechanics, even weather, but never the philosophy that had built his armored legions. The order that followed was characteristic of the regime. If the enemy built thousands of good tanks, Germany would build a few perfect ones. And so, the engineers doubled down. The Tiger II, the Königstiger, emerged from the drafting tables like an answer carved in defiance. 70 tons of armor, a gun that could destroy a Sherman from over 2 kilometers away, and lines that radiated menace. On paper, it was invincible. Alongside it came the Panther, faster, leaner, and designed to counter the Allied tide. They were machines of breathtaking ambition, each a marvel of geometry and metallurgy. But as the blueprints turned into metal, ambition became burden. Every new innovation demanded new alloys, new machining, new time. The Tiger II required engines that scarcely existed, gearboxes hand-built by exhausted craftsmen. Its final drive units cracked under strain. Its fuel consumption drained convoys dry. For every tank that reached the front, another 2 sat incomplete in workshops, waiting for parts that factories could no longer supply. The engineers knew it. They saw it in the ledgers. A machine that took months to build, hours to repair, and often minutes to lose. In their private notes, frustration replaced pride. Some wrote of missing materials, others of impossible tolerances. What had begun as a race toward mechanical perfection had become a struggle for survival against arithmetic itself. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, American plants continued to hum without pause, 2,000 Shermans a month, each identical, each functional. The contrast was not merely industrial, it was philosophical. Where Germany sought mastery, America sought momentum. One nation built machines to be admired, the other built them to endure. By 1944, German commanders no longer spoke of superiority. They spoke of scarcity. Tanks arrived without spare tracks, divisions without engines, crews without hope of reinforcement. In this new reality, the Sherman simplicity, once the object of laughter, looked like genius. At Kummersdorf, the same engineers who had mocked the foreign tank now studied its design with something like reverence. They had tried to perfect the art of war, and discovered too late that war was not an art at all, but an equation. And as the Allies prepared for the greatest invasion in history, that equation was about to be solved, not in the workshops, but on the fields of Normandy. June 6, 1944. Dawn over the English Channel. The sea is grey, the air thick with salt and exhaust. On the horizon, a tide of metal advances. Not ships this time, but what waits within them. As the ramps drop along the Normandy beaches, hundreds of M4 Shermans rumble forward into history. Their engines, roaring beneath steel decks, echo across the surf. For months, they had been built faster than bullets could destroy them. Now, they come ashore to prove what that meant. German defenders on the cliffs look down and see a familiar enemy, the same squat, unrefined silhouette they once mocked at Kummersdorf. They had read the reports, dismissed the numbers. Quantity over quality, they told themselves. But now, as tank after tank claws through the surf and onto French soil, quantity begins to look like inevitability. By nightfall, more than 2,000 Shermans have landed, and more are on the way. In the first weeks of the Normandy campaign, the contrast between engineering philosophies becomes brutally clear. The Tiger and Panther dominate the open fields. When they run, their 88mm guns slice through armor with terrifying precision. In a duel, a single German tank can destroy 2, even 3 Shermans before being flanked. Yet the war is not fought in duels. It is fought in motion, across mud, hedge, and ruin. And in that motion, the advantage begins to shift. For every Sherman that burns, another takes its place. Recovery crews work through the night under blackout tarps, dragging damaged tanks from the field, stripping them for parts, and sending them back within hours. Engines are swapped in a single evening, gearboxes changed by lamplight. Mechanics, many of them farm boys turned soldiers, fix in the mud what German engineers once called unworthy of attention. By dawn, tanks that had been crippled are moving again, dented, scarred, but alive. Across the line, the Tiger waits for parts that never arrive. A broken track immobilizes 57 tons of perfection. A damaged final drive takes weeks to replace. Mechanics search for tools made by companies that no longer exist, for materials their factories can no longer supply. Even when repaired, the Tiger consumes fuel that Germany no longer has. In the hedgerows, superiority becomes a luxury, and movement becomes survival. German crews begin to notice the imbalance. They destroy Shermans, yet the next day, the same fields are full again. The sky hums with Allied aircraft, and the roads fill with endless convoys. Each tank seems part of something larger, a system that regenerates faster than it can be broken. The Tiger's precision feels smaller now, almost irrelevant, against the sheer persistence of its enemy. For commanders, the lesson comes painfully. Reports from the front speak not of heroism, but of immobility. of tanks abandoned because they could not be moved, of battles lost not to courage or tactics, but to machinery that refused to work when it mattered most. A colonel writes bitterly, "We have built the finest tanks in the world and made them useless by our own hands." By August, the outcome is no longer in doubt. German armor retreats eastward, hampered by its own weight, hunted by tanks that seem to multiply each week. In the mud and smoke of Normandy, perfection collapses under its own promise. What began at Kummersdorf as laughter ends here as revelation. The Sherman's strength is not in its armor or its gun, but in its return. It fights, it falls, it rises again. It is not a masterpiece, it is a machine that endures. And as Allied columns push deeper into France, the battlefield itself becomes the verdict. The Tiger had been built to conquer. The Sherman had been built to continue. And in 1944, it was continuation, not conquest, that would decide the war. By the summer of 1944, the myth of the invincible German tank began to fracture, not in the factories or the laboratories, but on the battlefields themselves. From the hedgerows of France to the plains of the Eastern Front, a quiet arithmetic was rewriting the war. Engineers had once believed that a single Tiger could stand against 5 Shermans. In practice, it was often true, for an hour. But war did not measure victory by the hour. It measured it by endurance. Reports from the Eastern Front told a truth few in Berlin wanted to read. Tigers, with their massive Maybach engines and 88mm guns, averaged just 35 operational hours before mechanical failure. Axles snapped, transmissions overheated, and engines seized under their own weight. It was not enemy fire that destroyed most Tigers. It was movement itself. Crews often abandoned them intact, unable to repair or refuel what their own brilliance had built. By contrast, the American Sherman could run for 300 hours before serious maintenance. It did not boast the Tiger's range or its power, but it had something rarer: reliability. Where German tanks required the precision of engineers to keep moving, the Sherman needed only the persistence of its crew, and when it failed, it could be repaired within hours. Parts were interchangeable, tools universal, the process rehearsed thousands of times across the Allied front. This difference in philosophy became a difference in survival. The Tiger, though terrifying in its first encounter, was a solitary predator, powerful but unsustainable. The Sherman was a herd animal, born from industry, not artistry. American doctrine accepted this. In their manuals, they calculated the exchange ratio bluntly: 5 Shermans for every Tiger. But the key was not the number. It was that all 5 would arrive, start, drive, and fire. The Tiger's perfection mattered little when its rivals never stopped moving. German soldiers on the Eastern Front began to experience the same helplessness their engineers had felt at Kummersdorf. Columns of armor, majestic on parade, collapsed on the march. Fuel convoys never reached them. Spare parts became myths. Many units retreated not from fear, but from emptiness. Engines gone silent for lack of oil, treads frozen for want of grease. The Wehrmacht's armored divisions, once symbols of speed and innovation, were now defined by stillness. The Americans understood that movement itself was a weapon. Their logistics networks reached from the beaches of Normandy to the steel mills of Pittsburgh, an unbroken chain of momentum. Trains carried tanks to ports, ships carried them to Europe, and within days, broken machines were replaced by new ones. War had become an industrial current, and the Sherman was its vessel. To the Germans, this approach looked crude, even reckless. To the Americans, it was modernity in motion. The Sherman's mediocrity became its strength. It was light enough to cross bridges, simple enough to fix in the field, and numerous enough to absorb every loss. Where the Tiger inspired awe, the Sherman inspired inevitability. By late 1944, the results could be seen in every battle map. German divisions that once fielded hundreds of tanks now operated with dozens. A Tiger might appear at a crossroads, destroy several Shermans, then vanish, out of fuel, out of time. The Allied advance, however, never stopped. Behind every destroyed tank came 10 more, their engines humming in unison, their parts identical, their mission the same. The engineers in Germany had built for eternity, but war was not eternal. It was immediate, and it belonged to those who could adapt, not those who could perfect. What began as an industrial contest had become a moral one. The Sherman was not the better tank, it was the wiser idea, that strength lay not in precision, but in persistence. And as the Allies pushed toward the Rhine, that wisdom would prove decisive, for the Germans were about to confront a truth their engineers could no longer ignore. Winter, 1944. The war was turning, though few in Germany dared to admit it. Allied bombers now reached the heart of the Reich. The eastern horizon burned red each night. Yet in the city of Kassel, cradle of German tank design, the engineers gathered again for a familiar ritual. Another captured Sherman had arrived for study. Its armor was pitted and scarred, its paint dulled by months of service. To most, it was just another enemy relic. But to the men who had built the Tiger and the Panther, it was an uncomfortable mirror. They rolled it into the testing yard, its tracks grinding over the frost. The tank had sat untouched for weeks, exposed to rain and cold. Normally, any machine left that long would demand preparation, preheating, priming, adjustment. The Germans expected as much. But when they turned the Sherman's ignition, the engine started instantly. A dull, rhythmic growl filled the yard. The men exchanged glances. No smoke, no sputter. It ran as though it had never stopped. Tests began in silence. The gearbox shifted cleanly, the controls smooth and unstrained. The oil had thickened from the cold, yet the engine maintained steady pressure. One engineer, after inspecting the pistons, said quietly, "No German tank could endure this neglect." His voice carried a tone rare among them, respect tinged with resignation. For hours they pushed the machine through obstacles meant to break it, deep ruts, steep inclines, heavy turns. Still it moved, steady and unremarkable, as if unaware it was being tested. There was nothing majestic about it, nothing that stirred pride or fear. And yet, in its ordinariness, it revealed a truth they could no longer deny. The Tiger was a masterpiece, yes, a weapon that demanded reverence, but it also demanded everything else: resources, time, precision, faith. The Sherman, by contrast, demanded nothing but fuel. Where the German machines sought perfection, the Sherman sought persistence. It had no beauty to defend, no fragility to protect. It was built to exist, not to impress. As the tests continued, the mood in the yard changed. The laughter that once accompanied such examinations was gone. Engineers scribbled notes, not in ridicule, but in reluctant study. They measured tolerances, tested materials, inspected joints. Everywhere they looked, they found logic, not luxury. It was engineering without ego. By dusk, the day's data was compiled. The results were impossible to dispute. Startup success, 100%. Mechanical reliability, exceptional. Maintenance requirement, minimal. One observer wrote in the margin of his report, "This machine does not care who built it. It only cares that it runs." It was a line that would never appear in any official document, but it captured what many now felt. When the final report was drafted, its conclusion was brief, almost poetic in its restraint. "We have built for art. They have built for war. It was not bitterness, but clarity. The German engineers had pursued perfection as a reflection of their national pride, their sense of mastery over metal and mathematics. But in that pursuit, they had forgotten the purpose of war, not to impress, but to endure. The Sherman was not an engineer's dream. It was a soldier's ally. In that frozen yard near Kassel, surrounded by the fading echoes of industry, the men who had once defined German innovation understood, perhaps for the first time, that they had lost something deeper than a war of machines. They had lost the simplicity of purpose, the humility to build for need, not for glory. As the Sherman's engine finally shut down, its steady hum fading into the cold evening air, no one spoke. The sound lingered like a reminder of what might have been. And beyond Kassel, the factories that once forged perfection now stood silent, while in the west, those humble, unassuming machines kept moving eastward, one after another, toward Germany itself. By the beginning of 1945, the German war machine was no longer a machine at all. It was a collection of fragments, factories without power, trains without fuel, engineers without steel. The Reich that once prided itself on precision had become a nation of shortages. Even the men who designed the Tiger and Panther tanks now struggled to find the parts to repair them. The science of perfection had devoured itself. At the Henschel works in Kassel, the same assembly lines that had once hummed with confidence now stood silent, their tools cold beneath layers of dust. Allied bombers had turned industrial pride into rubble. Machine shops operated only when power flickered back to life. Workers scavenged copper wire from wreckage to keep motors running. Every new order from Berlin demanded an improvement: a thicker armor plate, a more powerful gun, a revolutionary transmission. Yet each refinement made the tanks more fragile, more difficult to build, and nearly impossible to maintain. The engineers knew it, but the ideology of perfection had become its own commandment. On the front lines, the results were catastrophic. By the winter of that year, more than half the Tiger fleet sat immobile, not because of combat, but because of breakdown. Some lacked engines, others fuel, others something as simple as a single bearing. Tank crews became mechanics, then scavengers, stripping abandoned machines to keep one or two alive. The battlefield, once the proving ground of German superiority, had turned into a scrapyard of stranded giants. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the factories of America continued their rhythm without pause. The Ford plant at River Rouge, the arsenal at Detroit, the foundries of Cleveland and Pittsburgh, all moved in unison. Every day, the assembly line sent hundreds of Shermans to Europe. Crates of spare parts followed them, engines, tracks, and gearboxes, all interchangeable, all replaceable. What Germany had called mediocrity had become a force of nature. By March, the contrast was complete. The Allies advanced behind a tide of machines that could be repaired faster than they could be destroyed. For every Tiger that roared into battle, 10 Shermans arrived to surround it. For every Panther immobilized by its own complexity, a dozen American tanks rolled past, each one expendable, each one replaceable. Perfection, once the symbol of German power, now ensured its collapse. In the design offices that still remained, a few surviving engineers began to understand the full weight of irony. They had built machines to last forever, yet they lasted less than a campaign. They had built them to inspire awe, yet they inspired exhaustion. What had begun as engineering pride had turned into industrial arrogance. Precision, unrestrained by practicality, had become fragility disguised as strength. There was bitterness in their realization, but also clarity. In one report written that spring, a senior designer remarked, "Every improvement increases failure. We have designed ourselves into defeat. His words were not an act of rebellion but of recognition, the moment when brilliance finally saw the shadow it had cast. And still, the Shermans came. They rolled through the Ardennes, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany itself. Thousands of identical machines, the same hum, the same sound, the same rhythm. Each one proof that the Americans had mastered not perfection, but endurance. By April, the Tiger factories ceased production. The engineers were evacuated, the blueprints burned, the forges extinguished. In their silence, one could hear the echo of what had gone wrong. The art of German engineering had never failed to produce masterpieces. It had only failed to understand that in war, masterpieces are luxuries a dying nation cannot afford. In the end, precision had become paralysis. The tanks that were meant to symbolize power now symbolized the cost of pride. The factories that once measured tolerances in microns could no longer measure time in days. And as the Allies crossed into the ruins of the Reich, the engineers who had once mocked simplicity were left to face their final calculation. The perfect had built their own defeat, while the ordinary had conquered the world. By 1945, the war no longer belonged to soldiers or generals. It belonged to factories. The clash of ideologies had become a contest of production lines, an equation of materials and minutes. Where once victory was measured in courage, it was now measured in output. And in that new language of war, America spoke with fluency unmatched in history. Germany had entered the conflict with a craftsman's pride. Its tanks, its aircraft, even its rifles bore the signatures of men who saw themselves as artists of steel. Each Tiger was a masterpiece, its parts hand-fitted, its tolerances perfect. But a masterpiece is slow. Each demanded attention, precision, care, and the war no longer waited for care. Across the ocean, another vision had taken root. In the United States, engineering was not a matter of artistry, but arithmetic. At the Ford Motor Company, the spirit of Henry Ford still guided production. Machines built not by masters, but by systems. The assembly line had turned the car from invention to commodity. Now that same principle turned the tank into a weapon of multiplication. At the River Rouge complex in Michigan, ore entered one end of the factory and tanks emerged from the other. Every 30 minutes, a new Sherman rolled off the line, identical, replaceable, unstoppable. There was no reverence for the individual machine, no pride in the uniqueness of its welds. Its purpose was its perfection. If it broke, it could be rebuilt. If it burned, it could be replaced. The design had become an idea, and ideas cannot be destroyed by fire. For Germany, this was incomprehensible. To the artisans of Krupp and Henschel, the very notion of mass production felt vulgar, an insult to craft. Their tanks were expressions of skill and identity, not of standardization. But as the war dragged on, the contrast became fatal. Each German improvement, thicker armor, finer machining, stronger alloys, required more time, more resources, more precision. The Americans, by contrast, simplified. Every bolt was standardized, every engine interchangeable. The Tiger was born from pride, the Sherman was born from process. This shift transformed the moral logic of war itself. Standardization, once a symbol of soulless industry, became a weapon of purpose. Factories replaced fortresses, riveters replaced knights, and the nations that could produce without pause held power no army could overcome. Behind every Sherman on the battlefield stood not an engineer's ego, but a system, a network of railroads, foundries, and men and women who worked in rhythm. Their precision was collective. Their mastery was repetition. For the first time in human history, efficiency became a kind of virtue. To the Germans who once believed that skill alone defined civilization, This was the cruelest irony. The machine they had ridiculed as crude and common had become the embodiment of inevitability. Every day, Allied production widened the gap. America's factories produced more tanks than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. Its engines powered not just machines, but momentum. By the final year of the war, the contest was no longer even or fair. Germany's artisans had built the best tanks in the world. Tanks they could not replace, machines they could not fuel. America had built a weapon not of metal, but of method, and that method consumed everything in its path. In the ruins of German industry, a few surviving engineers began to grasp the philosophical weight of what had happened. Perfection, they realized, had trapped them. It was a creed for peace, not for survival. In total war, beauty is irrelevant. What matters is endurance. The Tiger would be remembered as a monument of engineering, a symbol of what man could achieve when he sought mastery over detail. But the Sherman would become something greater, a symbol of what humanity could achieve when it surrendered mastery to necessity. Factories had beaten fortresses, simplicity had conquered sophistication, and the tank that was once laughed at had become the face of inevitability itself. In the ruins of Kassel, between the burned-out skeletons of once great workshops, a new truth was being forged, one that would define the century to come. The war ended not with the roar of engines, but with silence. Germany lay in ruins, its cities flattened, its factories gutted, its once proud engineering corps scattered among the rubble. In 1946, under the grey skies of occupation, the victors began their quiet work of questioning the vanquished. It was not soldiers they sought now, but thinkers, the men who had built the Tiger, the Panther, and the machines that once seemed unstoppable. In interrogation rooms across Allied Europe, German engineers sat beneath bare bulbs and answered questions not about weapons, but about philosophy. The Americans, practical and efficient even in victory, wanted to understand what had gone wrong inside Germany's war industry. They brought with them files, blueprints, test reports, and captured documents from Kummersdorf and Kassel. Among them was a report stamped Geheim, endurance testing of captured Sherman tank. One by one, the engineers were shown the data: operational hours, maintenance cycles, reliability figures. They had once dismissed those numbers as irrelevant, as the language of mediocrity. But now, under occupation, stripped of illusion, many saw the truth they had ignored. One of them, a designer from Henschel, reportedly said, "We never achieved such reliability, not once." He paused and then added, almost to himself, "Perhaps we never tried." The interviews took on a tone less of confession than of revelation. Another engineer, a former project leader on the Panther, spoke with quiet envy of the American production system. "They built tanks the way we built tools," he said. "Each part could belong to any machine. It was beautiful in its own way." His words, noted in the Allied transcripts, carried no bitterness, only the weary admiration of a craftsman who had witnessed a different kind of genius. Others were less willing to admit defeat. Some argued that German tanks were meant to be superior, that if only they had more time, more fuel, more freedom from interference, the outcome would have changed. But even they could not escape the evidence. Their perfect machines had collapsed under the weight of their own design. What they had worshipped as precision had betrayed them when confronted by the sheer momentum of simplicity. Among the younger engineers, those too junior to defend old dogmas, a new understanding began to form. They spoke of the Sherman not as an enemy, but as a teacher. One of them called it a machine without pride. It was a strange phrase, Yet it carried moral weight. The Sherman did not demand admiration, it demanded only to work. It was not the best, but it was always there. And that, in war, was everything. The post-war reports compiled by the Allies read less like military assessments and more like lessons in humility. The American success, one summary concluded, was not in technical excellence but in context. Their machines were part of a system. Ours were apart from it. In those words lay the essence of what had been lost, the understanding that even brilliance must serve a purpose greater than itself. In the years that followed, many of these same men would rebuild Germany's industry, this time not for conquest, but for endurance. They would design cars, tools, and machines that drew their strength from balance, not excess, and quietly, in workshops reborn from ashes, they would remember the tank that had once shamed them into wisdom. In the end, the Sherman became more than an American tank. It became a mirror, one that forced a generation of German engineers to confront the limits of their own perfection. And as they rebuilt their nation, they carried with them a final truth, learned too late and at too great a cost, that precision without purpose is only pride disguised as progress. When the guns finally fell silent, historians turned to the numbers. They sifted through wreckage, reports, and production logs, not to glorify the victors or the vanquished, but to understand how the war had truly been won. What they found was not a story of firepower or armor thickness. It was a story of arithmetic. Both sides began compiling data, meticulous, clinical, unfeeling. The Allies had produced more than 49,000 Shermans over the course of the war. Germany had built fewer than 1,400 Tigers, each a masterpiece of engineering, each demanding months of labor. But for every Tiger that rolled off the line, Germany lost something intangible: time, mobility, the ability to adapt. Their machines were built to fight battles. The Shermans were built to win a war. Post-war analysis revealed that the Sherman's repairability, its modular components and standardized parts, extended its operational life far beyond any German equivalent. A tank, destroyed on the field, could often be rebuilt from the remains of another. The Americans called it cannibalization. To the Germans, it looked like magic, but it was simply design logic, a machine that accepted its own impermanence. The numbers made the truth unmistakable. For every Tiger destroyed, 10 Shermans might be lost, but 9 would return to service within days. Germany's perfection, bound by its own intricacy, was irreplaceable. America's mediocrity, powered by simplicity, was eternal. On paper, the Tiger reigned supreme. In reality, the Sherman endured. In the logistics offices of the U.S. Army, planners had always understood what soldiers in the field came to see firsthand. Survivability was not just armor thickness, it was momentum. It was the ability to recover, to repair, to return. The Sherman was not a tank built for glory, but for continuity. Its weapon was not its gun. It was the vast, invisible web of men and machines that kept it alive. Economists studying the war's aftermath described it in the starkest possible terms. Germany had built machines that consumed genius. America had built machines that consumed distance. Each Tiger represented craftsmanship frozen in steel. Each Sherman represented a process that could never be stopped. The outcome was already written, not in strategy or bravery, but in the quiet mathematics of industry. For the German engineers who had once tested that first captured Sherman at Kummersdorf, the final reports must have read like an epitaph. The data confirmed what they had glimpsed years earlier in the snow. Reliability was not a compromise. It was a weapon. The machines that were mocked for their simplicity had carried entire armies across continents, while the machines of perfection died within sight of their factories. even decades later, historians continued to revisit the same conclusion. The war's verdict was not emotional, it was mechanical. The Sherman had not outgunned or out-armored its rivals. It had outlasted them. Its strength lay not in any single innovation, but in the system that surrounded it. A doctrine, a factory, a philosophy. And so the numbers, stripped of bias and pride, told the story better than any witness could. For every masterpiece that stalled, 1,000 workhorses moved forward. For every idea trapped in precision, another was liberated by practicality. In the cold balance of data, the truth was simple, final, and merciless. The engineers had built for art, the Americans had built for outcome, and history, as always, sided with the machine that kept moving. In the years that followed the war, the Tiger became legend. Photographs of its towering frame and devastating gun filled the pages of military history books. It was remembered as the pinnacle of German engineering, a symbol of mechanical supremacy, of what genius could achieve when unrestrained. But beneath that legend lay an irony deeper than its armor. The Tiger had not been defeated by an enemy. It had been defeated by itself. For all its power, it could not sustain the world that built it. It demanded too much: time, material, precision, a devotion that no nation at war could afford. Of the more than 300 Tigers built, most never fell to Allied fire. They broke down, ran dry, or were abandoned. The legend of perfection, when measured against reality, became a monument to inefficiency. The Sherman, by contrast, was never meant to be legendary. Its shape was unglamorous, its gun unremarkable, its armor unromantic. Yet it became the most influential tank of the century. The very qualities that once invited ridicule, its simplicity, its modular design, its standardization, would go on to define the future of armored warfare. In the decades that followed, every army that studied the lessons of World War II came to the same conclusion. Reliability was not mediocrity. It was mastery of another kind. Modern tank doctrine, from the British Centurion to the Soviet T-54, and later the American M60, followed the same philosophy born from Detroit's assembly lines: mobility, maintainability, and mass. It was not the tank that changed warfare, but the thinking behind it. The Sherman had proven that a weapon's strength lies not in its sophistication, but in its availability. It was not the sharpest sword that won the war, but the one that never dulled. The irony was profound. Germany, the nation that defined engineering excellence, had fallen not through failure of intellect, but through its excess. Its machines were too complex, its ambitions too grand, its craftsmanship too pure to survive the impurities of war. It was not ignorance that doomed them. It was brilliance without restraint. Innovation had become isolation, and isolation had become defeat. The Americans, in contrast, had embraced imperfection. They built with purpose, not pride. They thought less like artists and more like mechanics, and in doing so, they achieved something greater than perfection. They achieved endurance. Their factories outproduced genius itself. In hindsight, the Tiger and the Sherman stand as two philosophies cast in steel. One born of mastery that forgot its limits, the other of modesty that understood them. The Tiger remains revered, the Sherman respected. But in the long view of history, it is the unassuming machine, not the magnificent one, that reshaped the art of war. As post-war engineers designed the next generation of tanks, they no longer asked, "How can we make it flawless?" They asked, "How can we keep it running?" It was a subtle shift, but it changed everything. The machine had become not a symbol of national pride, but of collective survival. And so, the irony of mastery endures. that the side which sought perfection lost to the side that accepted imperfection, that in war, as in life, genius must serve a purpose greater than itself. The Tiger proved what man could build. The Sherman proved what man could sustain, and from that contrast, the modern world was forged. Kummersdorf today is quiet. The proving grounds where Germany once tested its most secret weapons have long since surrendered to time. The bunkers are cracked, the test tracks buried under grass and pine. Only the wind moves through the ruins, carrying faint echoes of engines that once shook the frozen air. Among those engines was one that came from across the sea, a foreign sound that, for a moment, unsettled the world's finest engineers. The Sherman that made them laugh in 1943 still exists. It rests now behind glass and steel, not far from where it was first tested, preserved in a museum, its olive paint restored, its radial engine still intact. Visitors walk past it slowly, reading the small plaque bolted to its side. The words are simple. Captured American M4 Sherman, tested at Kummersdorf, noted for reliability. It is an unremarkable sentence, yet behind it lies the story of a machine that outlasted empires. Across the same hall stands its old rival, the Tiger. Larger, darker, and more imposing, it draws the crowds first. Its massive gun points silently into the air, its armor gleaming under the lights. But look closer, and its power seems frozen. The hatches are sealed. The treads have not turned in 80 years. It is a monument, not a survivor. The Tiger is revered. The Sherman, by contrast, is still understood. Every scratch on its hull tells a story not of perfection, but of persistence, of mud, fire, and repair, of soldiers who trusted it not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. It was never meant to inspire awe. It was meant to come back. And it did, thousands of times. Visitors rarely notice the difference at first, the silence of one, the endurance of the other. But history does. The Tiger became a legend. The Sherman became a legacy. One symbolized mastery, the other, wisdom. On quiet afternoons, when the museum empties and the last light fades across the exhibits, the two machines face each other as they once did in war, one an artifact of pride, the other of practicality. Between them lies the lesson that engineers at Kummersdorf learned too late, that simplicity is not the enemy of greatness, but its foundation. The laughter that filled that cold morning in 1943 has long since faded. In its place remains a kind of respect for a machine that was never meant to be extraordinary, yet became indispensable, for a philosophy that won not through brilliance, but through endurance. History speaks softly now, from plaques and photographs, from engines long gone cold. Perfection breaks, simplicity endures, and as the light dies on the Sherman's weathered frame, the verdict of time becomes clear. They laughed at it once, they never laughed again.